as we settle back in, we're going to begin exploring the idea of self-worth more deeply. And for the rest of the session, I'll be walking you through what self-worth is, why we struggle with it, the differences between self-worth and self-esteem, and how to create a strong foundation of enoughness within yourself. And to start us off, I'd love for you to take a moment and share in the chat, maybe just in a word or two, what do you believe determines your worth in the world? And I'll put that question up. I'll share my screen so that you can see it as well. I'd say try not to answer for what you think is the right answer, but more how you typically operate day to day. I love asking this question because it's a good reminder that we're not alone in our feelings and beliefs around this. And this is a question I commonly ask. So I'll share some answers that I typically receive, as well as some in the chat. So some things I see pretty commonly, which I'm also seeing in the chat, are things like hitting life milestones by a certain time, accomplishment, success, what other people think of me, my usefulness to others, my productivity, being likable, how hard I'm working. I'm seeing monetary status, my uniqueness, what I do, feeling like I'm contributing to something, job and income, ability to provide, helping others, my mother's affection. Oh, so many good answers. I wish I could get to all of them. And for many of us, we're taught that our self-worth is tied to our successes and failures in our careers, relationships, and how productive we are. We attach our self-worth to the opinions of others. And nowadays, we even allow strangers on the internet and social media to be the judge of our worthiness. And as soon as we fail or lose approval, we experience feelings of low self-worth. And I found that many of us equate self-worth and self-esteem, thinking that our worth is attached to external things like what you're seeing on the screen and what's some of the things that are being listed in the chat. And I think like the good news is that these things do not actually determine your worth. Buddhism teaches that suffering arises from attachment. When we attach our worth to external conditions, we experience suffering. And the concept of no self reminds us that we are not defined by temporary roles, achievements, or failures. And so, if self worth is not equivalent to self esteem, what is it exactly? And I wanted to share that self worth is the internal sense of being good enough just as you are. It doesn't fluctuate based on success or failure. It's a foundation that stays with you steadily for all of life's circumstances, both the good and the bad. It isn't conditional or determined by external factors like career, success, failure, if you're likable, or if you're meeting societal expectations by a certain time in your life. And a healthy sense of self-worth is unconditional and distinct from our productivity and accomplishments. Self-worth does not involve comparing ourselves to others or allowing others to decide if we are enough. It's not something we can have more or less of. All humans deserve to be healthy, safe, loved, and supported simply because we exist. And so, how does it differ from something like self-esteem? While the two are often used interchangeably, they are actually quite different. So, I wanted to break down the key differences. So, self-esteem is how we evaluate ourselves. It's judgment-based and fluctuates based on external factors like success, failure, or comparison. Basically, a lot of the things that were showing up on the screen. It's inherently fragile, bouncing up and down according to our latest successes or failures. Self-esteem involves comparing ourselves to others and at times even trying to be better or superior than others. It involves judgment, whether positive or negative, it can go either way. And self-worth is recognizing that we are worthy regardless of those things. We have inherent value, which is independent of external factors or validation. And that unconditional self-worth is distinct from our abilities and our accomplishments. There's no judgment involved in it at all. It offers more emotional stability than self-esteem because it's always there for us. when we're on top of the world and achieving, and when we fall flat on our faces. And in Buddhism, happiness is often categorized in two forms. We have relative happiness and absolute happiness. And so understanding the difference between those two can help us reframe self-worth in a way that is more stable, unconditional, and not dependent on external factors. And so with relative happiness, that's conditional and fleeting. It's dependent on external conditions, achievements, relationships, material status, approval, circumstances going our way. And it feels real and fulfilling in the moment because life is constantly changing. And this kind of happiness is fragile and impermanent. And some examples of relative happiness would be feeling really happy because you got a promotion, but then later feeling inadequate if you lose your job. Another is feeling worthy when you're receiving praise, but doubting yourself when you're facing any type of feedback. Feeling good about yourself when things are going well, but feeling like a failure when you make a mistake, or when you make a mistake, spiraling on that mistake. And so relative happiness aligns with the concept of suffering because it is conditioned to those impermanent things. So if we attach our self-worth to it, we will inevitably feel unstable, being in control of, or being out of control, and riding the highs and lows of life where they're kind of in control of us. And then on the other hand, we have that absolute happiness, which is unconditional and unshakable. So, absolute happiness is not dependent on external conditions. It comes from within and is rooted with inner peace, self acceptance, and wisdom. It is the deep, stable sense of being whole and complete, regardless of life circumstances. And some examples of absolute happiness would be a feeling of worth and peace, whether you succeed or fail, accepting yourself fully and learning from your mistakes instead of seeing them as a way to quantify your worth, having gratitude for simply being alive rather than measuring your happiness by the way life is going. And so, absolute happiness is tied to liberation, a state where we are free from attachment and suffering because we recognize that true happiness comes from within. And so, when we tie our self worth to that relative happiness, we make it fragile. We only feel worthy when we meet certain conditions. We get, a promotion, we get approval, we have that external validation and success. And connecting self-worth to that relative happiness sounds like I'm almost there. I'm so close. I'll be able to enjoy my life once I fill in the blank. It's a never-ending chase to the next achievement, relationship, promotion, whatever it is that you feel like will be that enoughness. And so when we cultivate absolute self-worth, we recognize that our value is unchanging and independent of our circumstances. True self-worth is like that absolute happiness. It is not something we earn, prove, or chase. It is something we recognize as always present within us. And research backs this up. There's a study from the American Psychological Association that found that people who base their self-worth on achievement experience higher stress, anxiety, relationship difficulties, and also an increased likelihood of burnout. And so this brings me to a couple of important questions that I would love for us to take a few minutes to reflect on. So feel free to think about it mentally, or if you have a pen and paper, more than welcome to journal about this for maybe a minute or two. So the two questions are, where in your life are you tying your self-worth to external conditions? Maybe it's something you listed in the chat earlier, or maybe it's something else. And then as you sit with that, also think on the question, if your self-worth didn't depend on external validation, how do you think your life might change? And I'll just give you a couple minutes to reflect and think about these questions. And I would love to hear from you in particular about the question, if your self-worth didn't depend on external validation, how do you think your life might change? Maybe throwing in a word or two or a phrase or a sentence into the chat. And I'll share some of the responses I've received in the past as well. I'd feel more free is one I've heard a lot. Freedom is kind of a through line, a theme that I see a lot. I would accept myself for who I am. I think I would finally shake off the stuckness that has held me back from doing the really valuable work I want to do. I'd be much happier. I'd feel more in control. I'd stop waiting for the right time. I would live more in the present moment. My nervous system would be better regulated. There'd be less shame around mistakes. I would stop criticizing myself and be more self-accepting. As a woman in our society, the pressure to be beautiful and in great shape would be great if that would be erased. I would enjoy more delicious foods. I love that. I'd never have another harmful, emotionally unavailable relationship. I wouldn't be comparing myself to others. Thank you for sharing. I'll definitely be saving the chat and looking through everyone's answers later for sure. And to unravel this conditioning, to get us to that place where we feel more free, more accepting, to have more confidence, I think it's helpful to talk about why it is so hard for some of us to feel like we're enough. And firstly, our upbringing and attachment. So, as children, our sense of worth is often shaped by how caregivers responded to us. If love and validation felt conditional, like based on good behavior or achievements, we learn that our worth must be earned rather than innate. And a 2017 study found that adults with insecure attachment styles are more likely to tie self-worth to external approval. And so it can also kind of go the other way. You might have really loving parents, um, but they emphasize or validate you for things that you're good at as a kid. For example, like getting good grades, being good at sports, your appearance, your relationships. If you're told over and over again, you're really smart, and then suddenly one day you're out of school and you don't get grades anymore, it might, like for me in particular, that was kind of hard. I was like, oh no, what do I do now to prove that I'm a hard worker? And so those things can affect us. We also have society, media, and pop culture, and even social media that portray success in specific ways. So these messages can create the belief that our value as human beings is tied to external achievements, recognition, our appearance, etc. And the rise of social media has amplified comparison and external validation seeking. There's research linked to social media use that links with lower self-worth and increased anxiety due to that constant social comparison. And we often compare ourselves to others, especially in areas such as career achievements, wealth, appearance, and status. And when we perceive others as more successful, we feel inadequate or lacking in comparison, even though all humans have their own sets of strengths, values, and imperfections. And with social media, we often only see the highlight reel. We also live in a culture of productivity. So our social structures reinforce the belief that our worth is tied to what we produce. Studies show that people who measure their worth by achievements and external success have lower psychological well-being and higher stress levels. And our culture and our negativity bias doesn't really encourage us to be kind to ourselves. So we need to intentionally practice changing our relationship with ourselves in order to counter the habits of a lifetime. Our brain preferentially looks for negative information over positive information. It looks for threats, which is called the negativity bias. Our brains are biased mostly in that direction of threat, always scanning the world to keep us safe. It's an evolutionary trait meant to protect us from harm, but our brain doesn't know the difference between a saber-toothed tiger in the brush or a threat to our self-concept, like getting negative feedback at work or even self-criticism. And we also have another bias called confirmation bias, which is our tendency to interpret, search for, and recall information to confirm our beliefs or values. So if we believe we are not good enough, our brains are always searching for evidence to prove that. If we feel that belief that people don't like us, we are always looking for evidence to confirm that. We do this on autopilot, unconscious to the fact that this is happening. So it's only when we bring awareness to these things that we can really realize that we need to make some changes. And so it's really no surprise that so many of us struggle with self-worth between upbringing, societal conditioning, social comparison, and even the way our brains are wired. It's really easy to feel like we're never quite enough. And on top of these influences, there are also some common misperceptions or misconceptions about self-worth that can make it even harder to cultivate. And I'll just name a couple of these myths, and we can walk through why they're not true. The first one being, if I feel too satisfied with myself, I won't be motivated to grow. And self-worth is not complacency. It actually provides that stable foundation for healthy growth and personal development because we value ourselves and our potential. Another one is accepting myself as worthy would make me arrogant. And arrogance comes from a sense of superiority over others, while self-worth is about recognizing your value without diminishing the value of other people. So true self-worth is rooted in self-compassion, compassion for others, and also humility. Another is feeling worthy just isn't possible for me, which is not surprising based on what we've been talking about before with societal conditioning and upbringing. So past experiences, self-doubt, societal conditioning, all of those things can make self-worth feel unattainable. However, challenging limiting beliefs through self-reflection, therapy, meditation, self-compassion, coaching, all of this can help shift this mindset. And then lastly, having positive self-worth is selfish or egocentric. And it's actually more about realizing that you are worthy, just as worthy as anyone else. It's more about that inherent enoughness. Like if the word self kind of gets in the way, think about it more as just knowing that you and everyone else is enough, which includes that awareness of other people's worth. So it can actually bring upon a sense of common humanity with other people. And embracing self-worth doesn't mean stopping growth. It frees us to grow without the fear of failure or external validation. So, how do we begin to shift away from these external pressures and cultivate a sense of worth that is steady and unconditional? And the good news is that self-worth can be nurtured and strengthened through intentional practices. So, we'll walk through some of these things. And the first one I want to talk about is getting in touch with your core values. Modern culture equates busyness with worthiness, but who we are and what makes life meaningful for us is more important than what we produce. And so, sorry, just sharing my screen one more time. So, doing a quick practice of identifying our core values, maybe bring to mind a value or two of yours. You can take a moment to scan this list. You can also use words that are not on this list. This is not an exhaustive list of values. And just kind of think about what matters to you the most in life, what brings meaning into your life, how do you like to show up into the world? And once you have a sense of these values, it's the end of the day, which is my favorite time of day to ask a question like this, is asking yourself, how did I live by my values today? You can also go ask how your values showed up for you today. And doing this practice reminds us of the ways we're already doing what matters to us, that our lives have meaning. And I really love to do this in conjunction with like a gratitude practice because oftentimes gratitude will be something like someone doing something nice for you or like a meal you ate, but tying it to your values makes it even more of like a strong thing to look back on at the end of the day. So instead of measuring self-worth by achievements, shift to who you are rather than what you do. For example, if kindness is a core value, what's most meaningful to you is probably not how hard you worked today, but how kindness showed up. So were you kind to others? Were you kind to yourself? Did someone show you kindness? How did kindness show up? And getting in touch with that value at the end of the day can feel really fulfilling. And it also helps stop the mind from spiraling. If you did have negative things that happen throughout the day, if you can reconnect to your values, it helps build that self-efficacy, that self-trust, that self-acceptance. And recognizing our values gives us a foundation for self-worth. But how we think about ourselves daily can also play a huge role. Even when we know what matters to us, our thoughts can still get in the way. And that's where reframing comes in. I'd love to talk about how to practice reframing your thoughts, which involves intentionally shifting your perspective on a thought, situation, or belief to see it in a more constructive and balanced light. It's particularly helpful because it allows us to challenge the limiting beliefs that fuel self-doubt and replace them with thoughts that promote self-compassion and positive growth. It also gives us a little bit of that equanimity. It gives us strength to get through hard times and feel that calmness. It challenges all or nothing thinking, overthinking, catastrophizing by bringing our thoughts back to reality, to a more logical and supportive place. The brain's ability to reorganize and form new neural networks, new neural connections, is also called neuroplasticity, which you've probably learned a bit from Rick. It plays a key role in reframing. So by practicing new ways of thinking, we weaken the old unhelpful thought patterns and strengthen new positive ones. And consistently reframing self-doubt trains the brain to default to more constructive perspectives over time. So, some examples with self-worth in mind would be the thought might be, I have to prove my worth. And the reframe would be, my worth is inherent. I don't need external validation to feel whole. My worth isn't something that can be given or taken away by others. Another thought might be, I'm afraid of making mistakes and being seen as a failure. And a reframe might be, making mistakes is a part of being human, not a sign of failure. Each mistake is an opportunity to learn and grow, and it doesn't define my worth or abilities. And another thought might be, I'll be enough when I achieve fill in the blank of whatever it is. I make this much money, I own a home, I have kids, I get married, any of those things. And the reframe would be, my worth is not conditional. I don't need to wait for achievement to feel like I matter. I am enough right now, and I always have been. And sometimes we just need to meet ourselves where we are with kindness or even neutrality. And that brings me to the next one, which is self-compassion. Research shows that self-compassion is a stronger predictor of resilience than self-esteem, meaning that when we treat ourselves with care in difficult times, our self-worth becomes more stable. And self-compassion itself involves treating yourself with the care and concern you would give a friend when confronted with personal inadequacies, mistakes, failures, and painful life situations. It consists of three interacting components that were created by Dr. Kristen Neff, each of which has a positive and negative pole. So thinking about it as self-kindness instead of self-judgment, a sense of common humanity instead of isolation, and mindfulness instead of over identification or rumination. So the next time you get caught in self criticism or notice yourself seeking external validation, pause and ask, what would I say to a friend in this moment? You can also ask, how can I best support myself right now? You can also practice metta or loving kindness meditation to get in touch with this part of yourself. And I also think it's important to note that external validation isn't altogether a bad thing. We were talking about this a little bit before we went into the meditation earlier, but it's totally natural for humans to want external validation. Back when we were in hunter-gatherer bands, we needed it to feel safe and to survive within our group. And so wanting recognition at work or for, your partner to tell you they love you or that you're beautiful or that you're caring and kind, those things are not bad. It's when we equate that external validation to our worth as a person that it gets harmful. So I just wanted to note that external validation isn't something that we should never want. It's just when we need it to know that we are enough that it can be problematic because it's just then you just keep continuing to need it, which is more of that self-esteem than self-worth. And one of the biggest threats to self-worth is comparison. And in today's world, it's everywhere, like we've kind of mentioned before. Social media, career milestones, relationships. It's really easy to feel like we're falling behind. But what if instead of seeing others as a reflection of what we lack, we used comparison as a tool for inspiration? So instead of seeing others as a measure of our own worth, we can ask ourselves, can I be inspired by them instead? Or when comparison arises, you can shift to, what does this show me about what I value? What am I admiring here? Or even what need of mine isn't being met? And is there a way I could meet this? That doesn't require me to compare myself or judge myself when thinking about myself in relation to other people. Comparison often leads to chasing external validation, but true self-worth doesn't come from what other people think of us. It comes from within. So exploring a little bit about the difference between being driven by those external goals versus what matters to us. And that's shifting from extrinsic to intrinsic motivation. So extrinsic motivation is fueled by seeking external approval or rewards. It's external goals that do not provide fulfillment or joy by themselves alone. You're tying your worth to the outcome of that goal. So the reward comes once you achieve the goal. So you're always thinking about the outcome. Whereas intrinsic motivation comes from within. We go after goals because we find them interesting and enjoyable. We can use our values to explore that intrinsic motivation. If you find yourself interested in something, you can look at your values and see, does it tie to these things? It allows us to find joy in the process itself, not just in achieving the outcome. So the reward comes from doing something we love that matters to us. And it's much more about the process than the outcome. So if you're interested in learning more about self-worth, for example, or if you want to learn how to play an instrument, or if you want to get a new certification for your job, thinking about, am I pursuing this goal because it aligns with my values and brings me personal fulfillment, or because I'm seeking external validation or rewards? And you can also ask, and this is the question that I find really helpful, is will I enjoy the process of this, or am I only thinking of the outcome? Because sometimes when we think we want to do something, it might be coming from that need to impress other people or hit some milestone. And then once you get to that outcome, you either realize that the outcome isn't what you wanted, or then you have to start over to get some other outcome. You're like always outcome oriented. And there's so much space there where we can enjoy the process of something. And interestingly, one of the most unexpected ways to strengthen self-worth is through giving to others. Research shows that acts of generosity actually increase our happiness and well-being. And Buddhism teaches a similar principle. Dana, or generosity, is one of the six perfections that lead to wisdom and awakening. And in Buddhist thought, giving is not just helping others, it's about freeing ourselves from attachment to external validation. So when we give without expecting anything in return, we affirm that we already have enough, that we are enough. This is kind of ties to this quote that I love by the Dalai Lama that is, if you want others to be happy, practice compassion. If you want to be happy, practice compassion. And so, how can we practice generosity in ways that strengthen our self worth? And one way is just daily acts of kindness, offering small, intentional acts of kindness, complimenting a coworker, smiling to a stranger on a walk, sending an encouraging text to a friend that might not be expecting it, opening the door for someone, those really little things, saying hi to your barista that you see every morning and asking how their day's going. Another way is to give without expectation. So bringing coffee to a neighbor, donating to a cause, helping a friend move, not because you should, but because you can and you want to. And there's also the generosity beyond material gifts. So sometimes the most valuable thing you can give is your time, presence, or a listening ear. And one of my favorite ways to do this is also to practice Tonglen meditation, which is you imagine you're breathing in the suffering of others and breathing out relief and compassion. This simple shift in perspective fosters compassion and connection, which are two really amazing foundations of self-worth. And I find Tonglen meditation to be so helpful with the news that's going on in the world. When you start to feel helpless and like you can't do anything, that is an action that you can take. And then I also think that we can take a cue from nature. So when we look at a bud sprouting in the ground, we don't base its worth off of if it's a flower yet or what color it will end up. We don't judge mountains by how tall they are or trees by how many leaves they have grown. Mountains don't compare themselves to other mountains. And this is the idea of impermanence, which reminds us that nothing stays the same. Yet we don't question a flower's worth just because it's still growing. Why should we question our own? And just as a river doesn't try to hold onto its water, we don't have to hold on to judgments about ourselves to be worthy. Nature doesn't rush itself or force its own growth. It unfolds in its own time. And we too can cultivate that acceptance and patience with ourselves rather than measuring our worth by external milestones. And I kind of want to go back to those questions I asked in the meditation earlier and just like maybe open up the chat for a few words or maybe just a little moment of reflection, maybe picking up your journal or thinking internally about the stuff of what would you do differently if you knew that you were worthy? What dreams would you pursue if your self-worth wasn't at stake? What would you stop doing if you knew you were already worthy? And what do you think the world might look like if we all had a solid foundation of unconditional self-worth? If you want to take a couple minutes to reflect on any of these, you don't have to answer all of them. Maybe pick your favorites. I love reading these too. So, what would you do differently if you knew you were worthy? Take more risks, be more adventurous, try more things, not be afraid to fail, stop people-pleasing behavior, stop beating myself up for mistakes, breathe more easily, keep learning with curiosity. I would not feel like a failure at every job I had, do less and savor more, have more confidence, stop being attached to outcomes. Take it easier, more ease, less worry, more inner peace. And these things are all so positive sounding, which is kind of contradictory to the feelings of low self-worth that we shared earlier, which is characterized by just a consistent negative perception of oneself, judging and evaluating ourselves harshly, placing that sense of inadequacy or unworthiness at the core of our identity. And some ways that shows up are criticizing ourselves, unable to take compliments or downplaying our positive qualities when they're talked about, fixating on mistakes, shortcomings, and what we haven't accomplished yet, comparing ourselves unfavorably to others, and it can manifest in different ways. So at school or work, it might manifest as avoiding challenges, underperforming or overperforming, or fearing failure pretty much at every turn. In relationships, it might show up by feeling distressed by criticism or disapproval, needing a lot of reassurance. In social interactions, it might show up as people pleasing, struggling with boundaries. In personal confidence, feeling shy or self-conscious or unworthy of attention. In emotional well-being, we might withdraw or overshare. It can kind of go both ways with all of these. And in self-advocacy, less likely to stand up for ourselves, making ourselves more vulnerable to neglect or even being mistreated. And so thinking about all these ways that you can build self-worth, whether it's connecting with your values, practicing self-compassion, thinking about your goals more extrinsic or intrinsically than extrinsically, reframing your thoughts, all of those things can help us get to a place where that self-worth feels like it's coming from within, that it's inherent. I'm going back to the chat. More present, less in the past and future, not feeling guilty that I'm disappointing others. Somehow this topic of recognition of inherent worth is also tied to being in a sense of dignity, returning to dignity, worth when knocked off or slipped off those places. Dignity of risk too. Eating more delicious food. These are all so wonderful. And as we kind of wrap up this discussion, I just want to share again that embracing self-worth is also embracing positive growth. Just having that freedom to grow without the fear of failure or upsetting other people. Obviously, we don't want to hurt other people, but without that need for external validation, we can kind of shift away from those pressures and just start to live more like what's being put in the chat right now, more present, more confident, like not waiting until it feels like the right time, living in the present, just happier and freer. And kind of thinking about if you were to rate your self-worth on a scale of 1 to 10 after the meditation and talk, I'd love to hear just kind of where you would rate it. You don't have to put a number in the chat, but if you notice maybe if there's been any shift, I would love to hear that. And then also open up the floor to any questions or comments. I'm just so thankful for you for being here and sharing your evening with me. And I hope this has been a reminder that you are enough. And I hope you let these feelings of worthiness radiate out into the world around you. I see Elaine has a raised hand, so I'm gonna.
Yeah, Elaine, you want to unmute yourself?
Yeah, thank you. And sorry, I can't put the video on because I have a wonky connection and it might kick me off. Thank you, Claggy. I love this. This was wonderful. And I'm thinking about Rick's talk last week, and somewhere in that talk, and he's often talked about in practicing meditation, especially in the Buddhist tradition, there's this sense of like a cart with two wheels, and
Mm,
that the one wheel is you're already enlightened, there's nothing to attain. You can't become enlightened if it wasn't already there, right? It's kind of there versus practice, right? There's a road, there's practice, there are different kinds of meditation, and they're both needed. And so it is kind of both a question and a comment because this either or, at least in me, creates certain anxiety. Like, oh, I let them judge me and it's important to me, and now I'm feeling less self-worth or something. So um, why can't they both operate and be true? Um, that we have these two wheels of the cart, and can't they both be somewhat important? And I know, I mean, it seems to me there's something negative to going like, I don't care what you think about me. Like if
mm-hmm.
someone praises you or something, and it's like, you don't have to say that because, I don't care. So there's
Yeah,
something about acknowledging at least the good things people might say about you or to you, and just leave away the bad things that other people might say. But we do operate in a world, and like even one of the last things you said is rate how you feel now. It's just like laughing because there's that rate judgment again, and it's like we can't get away from that scaling and judgment. Anyway,
yeah,
I
that's a
hope
good
that
point.
made sense. I'm tired. It's been a long day.
Yeah, oh, it has. And I think that the idea of the cart with the two wheels is important. And I think that both can coexist. I think that having confidence in your abilities, which is kind of tied to that self-esteem, can support your ability to take risks, pursue growth, and engage in meaningful work. But also, I think that oftentimes what's missing is that self-worth, grounding yourself in that stable sense of self-worth to ensure that you don't feel like a failure when things don't go as planned. I think that self esteem itself is not necessarily a bad thing. It's just that when that's the only thing we have that we're basing our worth off of, that makes it very, very fragile and goes up and down. Like I said earlier, it's very natural to want validation from other people. It's the awareness of, is that something I am basing my worth off of completely, or is it just a natural part of being human? The challenge comes when self esteem is the only thing driving that personal growth, or if you only feel good enough when you're achieving, learning, improving, growing, it can start to feel like that never ending chase. So when that growth model is kind of rooted in self worth, it becomes a process of self-expression rather than being enough. I hope that makes sense. That it's kind of like acknowledging the importance of that connection with others and validation, and not saying it in the way of like, I don't care what other people think, because I don't think it is quite that. I don't care what other people think. It's I might care what other people think, but I'm worthy regardless of what they think, if that makes sense.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much. Yes.
Of course. Yeah, thank you for asking. scanning the chat to see if there's any questions. But if anyone else wants to ask, feel free to raise your hand as well. And someone put a Thich Nhat Hanh quote in the chat that I really like. We're all perfect with room for improvement. Still a work in progress. Someone asked to talk about arrogance and self. And I think a usual distinction is that arrogance often comes from insecurity. It can be a defense mechanism to prove superiority, where like self-worth, on the other hand, is kind of about quiet confidence, that like quiet sense of being enough. You're not talking about it or bragging or, acting it out in the world in a way that makes it seem like other people are less than you. Whereas sometimes the arrogance can show up in that way. Like self-worth isn't thinking I have all the answers or that I don't care what other people think. It's about knowing that I have value while staying open to learning and evolving and being in community with others, where arrogance is a little bit more closed off. And I see a question from Joe. Feel free to unmute.
Go ahead, Joe.
Yeah, thank you, Claggy. What a brilliant talk. I loved it, and provoked a lot of reflections from everyone. But I have a question about. I heard you mention the word anatta early on, the no self concept, and I was wondering if you could share a few thoughts about how self-worth relates to no self or the concept of anatta. Do you have any words on that?
Yeah, it's like at first glance, it kind of seems contradictory, but no self or anatta teaches us that there is no fixed, independent self, that our identity is fluid, shaped by conditions, relationships, and impermanent experiences. So self-worth is more affirming that intrinsic value. So rather than the self-worth being like clinging to the idea of self, and I know that having the word self in it makes it feel like it is very self-focused, but it's more of an openness to being. So that deep recognition that even without the fixed definitions of self, we are still deserving of kindness and care and belonging. So instead of saying something like, I am worthy because of who I am, it could be more like, there is no fixed me to prove, and yet I am inherently a part of this world and I deserve compassion, safety, connection, care, etc. Like not thinking of self-worth as an identity, but more of an attitude of compassion toward ourselves and our experiences. Yeah, sorry. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you. I like it as an attitude. Yeah.
Yes, as an attitude. Yeah. I think sometimes it's hard to like kind of have that distinction between using that word self and feeling like it is that fixed thing. And so sometimes I like to use the word enoughness instead, because that's more of like I don't know, an attitude and embodiment than thinking of the self.